Kepler Station's Central Military Institute had seen its share of impossible students over the centuries, but nothing quite like the current crisis unfolding in Faculty Lounge C deck. Captain Brooke pushed through the sliding doors just in time to hear Professor Ketmar's crystalline voice crackling with mathematical frustration. The probability matrices are completely destabilized, the translucent being declared, his geometric form pulsing with agitated blues and reds. These three specimens have created chaos variables that exceed all computational parameters. Commander Voss, all six of his muscular arms gesticulating wildly, leaned forward across the circular table. Computational parameters? Ketmar? They hospitalized Instructor Feldun yesterday, put her in a back-to-tank for 3 days, and that was just from their greeting ritual. Brooke grabbed a cup of what the food synthesizers optimistically called coffee and settled into a chair at the edge of the group. The faculty lounge buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that only came from educators who'd completely lost control of their classroom. She'd seen it before on a dozen different worlds, in a dozen different species, but the underlying panic was always the same. "What exactly are we talking about?" she asked, though she had a pretty good idea. The entire lounge went quiet. 12 pairs of alien eyes, well, eye equivalents in some cases, turned toward her with the kind of expression usually reserved for someone who'd just volunteered to juggle live plasma grenades. Dr. Yithara, an elegant being whose species resembled a cross between a praying mantis and a harp, tilted her triangular head. "You haven't heard about the Ursine problem?" "The Cubs," Voss spat, and somehow managed to make it sound like a curse word. 3 of them, from the Ursine Collective's warrior caste. They're supposed to be here for diplomatic integration training, but they're treating the academy like their personal gladiator arena. Brooke sipped her synthetic coffee and tried not to wince. "Let me guess. They don't respond well to traditional disciplinary measures?" Ketmar's form shifted to an alarming shade of orange. "Traditional measures? Captain, we've tried neural dampening fields, isolation protocols, even brought in their own species' military advisors. Nothing works. They are fundamentally incompatible with civilized educational environments." "Incompatible," Brooke repeated slowly. "That's an interesting word choice." "It's an accurate word choice," Professor Helvek interjected. The amphibious educator's throat sac inflated with indignation. "These aren't normal students, Captain. They're barely civilized. 3 cycles ago, they turned the advanced tactical simulation into what they called a proper hunt, destroyed 500,000 credits worth of equipment, and somehow managed to reprogram the holograms to attack the other students." Brooke raised an eyebrow. "They reprogrammed military-grade simulation software during a combat exercise?" "That's not the point." Voss slammed 2 of his hands on the table. "The point is, they can't be controlled. They don't follow orders. They don't respect authority. They don't even seem to understand the concept of a classroom hierarchy." "Fascinating," Brooke murmured, and she genuinely meant it. The looks she got suggested that fascinating wasn't the word most of her colleagues would have chosen. Terrifying seemed more popular. So did catastrophic and career-ending. Professor Ketmar's geometric form had shifted to a deep purple that Brooke's cultural database helpfully informed her indicated extreme agitation in his species. "Captain, perhaps you don't fully comprehend the severity of this situation. These 3 individuals have rendered our most advanced pedagogical methods completely ineffective. They respond to neither positive reinforcement nor negative consequences. They appear to operate on some primitive pack mentality that has no place in a modern military academy." "Pack mentality," Brooke said thoughtfully. And they're from a warrior culture? The most aggressive in the known galaxy, Dr. Yathara confirmed, her antennae twitching nervously. The Ursine Collective doesn't even have a word for surrender in their primary language. Their idea of diplomacy involves seeing who can survive the longest in hand-to-hand combat. Brooke leaned back in her chair and studied the assembled faculty. Some of the finest military educators in the galaxy, representing species with technology that made human achievements look like cave paintings. All of them stumped by 3 students who wouldn't sit still and follow directions. "What are their names?" she asked. "Names?" Voss looked confused. "They don't use individual designations. They're addressed by their pack positions. The largest one is called Gruff, something to do with vocal patterns, I think. The middle one is Patch, because of his fur markings. The smallest goes by Rumble. And they're all in the same classes?" "When they bother to attend," Helvek said sourly. "Most of the time they simply appear, usually when there's some kind of conflict or excitement. Yesterday they materialized in the middle of Professor Quilneth's advanced xenobiology lecture because they heard raised voices and assumed there was going to be a fight." "Was there going to be a fight?" "Well, no. Professor Quilneth was just explaining the reproductive cycle of Altarian slugworms. But after the cubs arrived, there definitely was a fight. 3 of them, actually." Brooke couldn't suppress a smile. "Sounds like they know how to liven up a biology lecture." The silence that followed was so profound that she could hear the station's life support systems humming in the walls. Finally, Professor Ketmar's form flickered through several colors before settling on a dim gray. "Captain," he said carefully, "are you suggesting that this situation is amusing?" "I'm suggesting," Brooke replied, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate precision, "that maybe you're approaching this from the wrong angle." Commander Voss's 6 arms crossed in perfect unison. "And what angle would you suggest? We've consulted with military psychologists, behavioral specialists, even xenocultural anthropologists. The consensus is unanimous. These individuals cannot be integrated into a standard academic environment." "Standard academic environment," Brooke repeated. "There's that word again. Standard." She stood up and walked to the large viewing window that dominated one wall of the lounge. Beyond the transparent aluminum, the Institute's training grounds stretched across the station's lower levels. Cadets from dozens of species moved through synchronized drills, their movements precise and coordinated. It was beautiful in its own way, like watching a perfectly programmed machine. "Tell me," she said, without turning around, "what exactly are you trying to teach them?" "Military protocol," Voss answered immediately. "Chain of command, tactical analysis, strategic planning. The fundamentals of interspecies cooperation in combat situations." "And how are you teaching these things?" Dr. Yathara's antennae drooped. "Standard pedagogical methods, lecture-based information transfer, practical examinations, scenario-based learning modules, all designed for species that value order, hierarchy, and intellectual analysis over physical prowess and instinctual responses," Brooke finished. The faculty exchanged glances. Professor Helvek's throat sac deflated slightly. "Captain, are you implying that our educational methodologies are somehow inadequate?" Brooke turned back to face the room. "I'm implying that you're trying to teach wolves how to be sheep, and then acting surprised when they refuse to cooperate." "Wolves?" Ketmar's form pulsed with confusion. "Earth predators, pack hunters, highly intelligent, fiercely loyal to their own kind, and completely uninterested in following rules that don't make sense to them." She walked back to her chair, but didn't sit down. The question isn't how to make them fit your system. The question is whether your system is worth fitting into. That got their attention. All of it. The kind of attention that suggested she'd just committed academic heresy in front of the faculty senate. Commander Voss was the first to find his voice. "Captain, I hope you're not suggesting that we should lower our standards to accommodate disruptive behavior. I'm suggesting that maybe your standards aren't as universal as you think they are." Brooke looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "You've got 3 students from a warrior culture that values strength, courage, and loyalty above everything else, and you're trying to teach them by making them sit quietly in chairs while someone lectures them about theoretical combat scenarios. It's worked for every other species," Professor Helvek protested. "Has it? Or have the other species just been better at pretending it works?" Brooke shrugged. "Either way, it's pretty clear that your current approach isn't getting results with these 3. So you have 2 choices. Send them back to their home system as failures, or try something different." "Such as?" Dr. Yathara asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Brooke smiled. It wasn't a particularly reassuring expression. "Such as letting me take them." The reaction was immediate and unanimous. Every being in the room started talking at once, their voices creating a cacophony of concern, outrage, and what sounded suspiciously like panic. Through the noise, Brooke could make out fragments of protests about her absolute insanity, career suicide, and something about insurance policies not covering dismemberment by hostile students. She waited for the chaos to die down, then raised her voice just enough to cut through the remaining chatter. "I teach tactical combat psychology, human military methodology. Something tells me these cubs might find that more interesting than advanced theoretical xenobiology." Professor Ketmar's form had gone completely transparent, which Brooke's database informed her was the crystalline equivalent of a panic attack. "Captain, these individuals have already hospitalized 2 instructors. What makes you think you can succeed where others have failed?" "Because," Brooke said, already heading for the door, "I'm not going to try to tame them. I'm going to try to understand them." As the door slid shut behind her, she could hear the faculty lounge erupting into renewed chaos. She smiled to herself as she walked down the corridor toward the Institute's administrative offices. This was either going to be the most interesting teaching assignment of her career or the shortest. Possibly both. The administrative paperwork took exactly 18 minutes to process, which was either a record for bureaucratic efficiency or a sign that everyone desperately wanted the cubs to become someone else's problem. Brooke suspected it was the latter, especially given the way Administrator Pelquan had practically thrown the transfer documents at her while muttering something about liability insurance and next-of-kin notifications. Now she stood outside classroom Delta 9, listening to what sounded like a small war being fought on the other side of the reinforced door. The periodic thuds and crashes suggested that furniture was being weaponized, while the occasional roar indicated that at least one of the cubs had discovered the room's acoustics were perfect for intimidation displays. She checked her chronometer. The class had been scheduled to start 10 minutes ago. Technically, she was late, though given the circumstances, punctuality seemed like the least of her concerns. The door's security panel blinked red, indicating that the room's emergency lockdown protocols had been activated. Brooke pressed her palm to the scanner and waited while the system verified her authorization. The light turned green, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. The scene that greeted her was educational. Gruff, the largest of the 3 cubs, had apparently decided that the instructor's podium made an excellent fortress. He crouched behind it in a defensive posture, his massive frame making the furniture look like a child's toy. His dark brown fur was streaked with lighter patches that gave him a grizzled, battle-scarred appearance, though Brooke suspected he was probably younger than most of her other students. Patch occupied the center of the room, standing on top of what used to be a conference table. His distinctive white facial markings were the source of his nickname, creating symmetrical patterns that made him look like he was wearing war paint. In his hands, he held two chair legs that he'd apparently removed from their original furniture, wielding them like clubs while eyeing the room's remaining fixtures with obvious intent. Rumble, the smallest of the trio, had claimed the far corner and was methodically shredding student workbooks into confetti. His fur was the darkest of the three, almost black, and his movements had a precise, focused quality that suggested intelligence rather than mindless destruction. All three froze when they saw her. The silence stretched for approximately 5 seconds before Gruff rose to his full height and issued what Brooke's translator helpfully identified as a formal challenge to single combat. His voice was a deep, rumbling bass that seemed to resonate in her chest cavity. "New teacher thing," he growled, the words coming slowly as he worked through the standard galactic pronunciation. "You small, you soft, you not worthy to instruct warriors." Brooke looked around the devastated classroom, taking in the scattered furniture pieces and the claw marks gouged into the walls. Then she walked to the only intact chair remaining in the room, pulled it to the center of the space, and sat down. The cubs stared at her. She pulled a sandwich from her bag. Synthesized protein on actual bread, one of the few luxuries she'd managed to acquire during her last supply run, and took a bite. The sound of chewing seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. "Aren't you going to fight?" Patch demanded, his translator giving his voice a higher, more aggressive pitch. "The other teacher things always fight. Or run. Or make the hurting sounds." Brooke swallowed her bite of sandwich and considered the question. "Why would I fight you?" "Because," Gruff began, then stopped. His massive head tilted slightly to one side, as if the question had genuinely confused him. "Because we challenged you. Because we destroyed your teaching space. Because that is what happens." "Is it?" Brooke took another bite and chewed thoughtfully. "What happens after the fighting?" "Victory," Rumble said from his corner, speaking for the first time. His voice was quieter than his companions', but there was something in his tone that suggested he was the thinker of the group. "The strong teach. The weak learn or leave." "And then what?" The three cubs exchanged glances. It was Patch who finally answered, though he sounded less certain than before. "Then, learning happens? Does it?" Brooke pulled out a second sandwich and set it on the floor beside her chair. "Because, from what I heard in the faculty lounge, you've had a lot of victories, but not much learning." Gruff's stance shifted slightly, his weight moving from his back legs to his front. It wasn't quite aggressive, but it wasn't relaxed either. "You mock us." "I'm asking you a question." Brooke set a third sandwich next to the second. "You've been here for what? 3 months? You've defeated how many instructors? And what exactly have you learned about military tactics? About interspecies cooperation? About anything that might actually help you protect your people?" The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This one had weight to it, like the moment before thunder. Rumble was the first to move. He left his corner slowly, approaching Brooke's chair with the careful movements of a predator testing unfamiliar territory. When he reached the sandwiches, he stopped and looked up at her with intelligent dark eyes. "You are different," he said. It wasn't a question. "Different how?" The other teacher things fear us, or they try to make us fear them. You do neither. Brooke nodded and took another bite of her sandwich. Fear's not very useful in a learning environment. Makes it hard to think clearly. Patch jumped down from his table, landing with surprising grace for someone his size. You think we can learn? I think you're already learning. You figured out how to reprogram military-grade simulation software in the middle of a combat exercise. That's not exactly something you do by accident. Gruff's defensive posture relaxed slightly. The hunting simulation was weak. Prey that does not fight back teaches nothing. So you made it fight back. We made it more real. The big cub's voice carried a note of pride. Real hunters. Real danger. Real consequences. And the other students? Learned to hunt properly, Patch said with satisfaction, or learned they were not hunters. Brooke finished her sandwich and brushed the crumbs from her hands. Tell me about your homeworld. The request seemed to catch them off guard. Rumble settled cross-legged beside the sandwiches, though he didn't take one. Our world. Your people. Your culture. What makes a warrior in the Ursine Collective? Gruff moved closer, his massive frame casting a shadow across half the room. Warriors protect the pack. Warriors hunt for the pack. Warriors die for the pack if needed. And how do you become a warrior? By proving yourself, Patch said, settling beside his companions. By showing courage. By showing strength. By showing wisdom. Wisdom? Knowing when to fight, Rumble explained. Knowing when to hunt. Knowing when to protect and when to retreat. A warrior without wisdom is just a killer. Brooke leaned forward slightly. And how are you supposed to prove these things here? The question hung in the air, like a challenge none of them quite knew how to answer. Finally, Gruff spoke, his voice slower and more thoughtful than before. The other teacher things. They speak of battles we have never fought, enemies we have never seen. They show us pictures and sounds and tell us to remember. But how does remembering make us warriors? It doesn't, Brooke said simply. Information isn't wisdom. Facts aren't experience. And theory, sure as hell, isn't courage. She stood up and walked to the damaged podium, running her hand along the claw marks Gruff had left in the metal surface. You want to know what I think? I think you've been stuck in classes designed for species that learn by listening and memorizing. But you're not listeners. You're doers. You learn by doing, by testing, by pushing boundaries, until you understand where the real limits are. The other instructors do not agree, Rumble observed. The other instructors are trying to turn you into something you're not. Brooke turned back to face them. They want obedient students who follow orders without question. But warriors don't follow orders blindly, do they? They follow leaders they respect, for reasons they understand, toward goals they believe in. Patch had unconsciously moved closer to the sandwiches. You respect us? I respect what you could become, what you're trying to become. Brooke walked back to her chair and sat down again. The question is whether you're willing to do the work to get there. What work? Gruff asked. Brooke smiled. It was the kind of expression that had made enemy commanders nervous on a dozen different battlefields. Learning to be warriors instead of just fighters. Learning to think like soldiers instead of just predators. Learning to protect something bigger than your pack. Bigger than the pack? Rumble's voice carried a note of genuine confusion. What is bigger than the pack? That, Brooke said, is what we're going to find out. She gestured toward the sandwiches. But first, lunch. Can't learn properly on an empty stomach, and I'm guessing you haven't eaten since you started redecorating my classroom." The three cubs looked at each other, then at the food, then back at her. Some kind of silent communication passed between them, the kind of wordless understanding that only came from years of fighting side by side. Finally, Gruff picked up one of the sandwiches and examined it carefully. "This is sharing food? It's called hospitality. It's what humans do when we want someone to know they're welcome." "Welcome," Patch repeated slowly, as if testing the word. He reached for the second sandwich. Rumble took the third, but didn't unwrap it immediately. Instead, he studied Brooke with those intelligent dark eyes. "Teacher thing Brooke, why do you welcome us when others do not?" "Because," she said, settling back in her chair as the three cubs began to eat, "you remind me of soldiers I used to know. Good soldiers. The kind who'd follow you into hell if they believed in the mission, but who'd tear your throat out if you tried to send them somewhere without a damn good reason." "And the reason?" Gruff asked between bites. Brooke looked out the classroom's viewport, where the stars wheeled slowly past the station's rotation. Somewhere out there, in the vast darkness between worlds, were threats that none of their species had faced alone. Challenges that would require not just strength or intelligence, but both. And maybe, just maybe, a new kind of warrior to meet them. "The reason," she said, "is that the galaxy's about to get a lot more dangerous. And when it does, we're going to need warriors who can think, fighters who can adapt, and protectors who can work together even when everything they've ever known tells them to stand alone." She turned back to her students, who were listening with the kind of focused attention she'd never seen them give to any other instructor. "Think you three are up for that kind of challenge?" The answering growls were probably meant to be intimidating, but to Brooke, they sounded suspiciously like acceptance. 3 weeks later, Brooke discovered that having 3 enormous alien bodyguards was both the best and worst thing that had ever happened to her teaching career. The best part was obvious. Nobody interrupted her lectures anymore. When a 600-pound Ursine warrior is sitting attentively in the front row taking notes, even the most disruptive students tend to find sudden fascination with their coursework. Her tactical combat psychology classes had become the most well-attended sessions in the Institute, though she suspected curiosity rather than academic enthusiasm was driving most of the enrollment. The worst part was currently unfolding in the faculty cafeteria, where Gruff had just informed a table of Centauri diplomacy students that their conversation was too loud for proper eating, and suggested they find quieter voices or quieter graves. "Gruff," Brooke said calmly, not looking up from her meal. "Sit down." The massive cub looked confused. "But teacher thing Brooke, they disturb your feeding time." "They're having a discussion about trade negotiations. It's supposed to be loud. That's how Centaurians show enthusiasm." Patch, who had been eyeing the dessert station with obvious predatory intent, tilted his head. "Enthusiasm looks like anger sounds. Different species, different customs. Remember what we talked about in class yesterday? Cultural context determines behavioral interpretation," Rumble recited dutifully from his seat beside her. Of the 3 cubs, he'd proven most adept at memorizing the concepts she taught, though she suspected he understood them on a deeper level than his companions realized. The Centauri students, meanwhile, had gone completely silent and were staring at the cubs with expressions that Brooke's xenocultural database helpfully identified as profound terror mixed with morbid fascination. She sighed and stood up. "Gentlemen," she addressed the diplomatic students, "meet my teaching assistants. They're helping me demonstrate the practical applications of interspecies psychological warfare." One of the Centaurians, A young male whose head tendrils were trembling with either excitement or fear raised a tentative hand. "Excuse me, Professor Brooke, but are those the cubs that hospitalized Instructor Feldune?" "They are, and they've learned a great deal about controlled application of force since then." She looked pointedly at Gruff. "Haven't you?" The big cub's ears drooped slightly. "Yes, Teacher Thing Brooke. We do not hospitalize beings without proper cause now." "What constitutes proper cause?" another Zentorian asked, apparently too fascinated by this glimpse of controlled lethality to maintain appropriate caution. Gruff considered the question seriously. "Direct threat to Pack. Direct threat to Teacher Thing Brooke. Direct threat to learning space. Or—" He paused, looking to his companions for confirmation. "Insufficient respect for educational environment." "Insufficient respect?" The first student's tendrils curled with what Brooke recognized as academic curiosity, overriding survival instinct. "Could you define that more specifically?" "Gruff," Brooke warned, but it was too late. The big cub had discovered something more dangerous than his natural predatory instincts. He'd discovered he enjoyed teaching. "Insufficient respect includes," he began, counting off on his massive claws, "disrupting learning time with irrelevant noise-making, disrespecting Teacher Thing Brooke's wisdom sharing, wasting food while others hunger, showing weakness when strength is needed for pack survival." The cafeteria had gone completely quiet. Every student, faculty member, and support staff was listening with the kind of rapt attention usually reserved for natural disaster warnings. Patch, apparently feeling left out of the educational moment, added helpfully, "Also, touching Teacher Thing Brooke without permission results in immediate claw and tooth response." A collective shiver ran through the assembled diners. "Right," Brooke said quickly. "I think that covers the basics of Ursine social protocols. Everyone back to your meals, please." As conversations gradually resumed around them, though at considerably lower volumes, she settled back into her chair and fixed her three students with what she hoped was a stern look. "We've talked about this. You can't threaten other students just because they get too close to me." "But pack leader safety is priority," Rumble protested quietly. "Other species do not understand proper respect distances." "I'm not your pack leader. I'm your instructor." The three cubs exchanged one of their silent communication looks. Finally, Gruff spoke, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Teacher Thing Brooke. What is difference?" The question caught her off guard. In human military culture, the distinction was clear. Instructors taught, leaders commanded. But she was beginning to realize that the cubs didn't see those roles as separate. To them, anyone worthy of teaching was automatically worthy of following, and anyone worthy of following was automatically worth protecting. "The difference," she said slowly, "is that leaders give orders they expect to be obeyed. Instructors share knowledge and hope it's understood." "But your knowledge sharing makes us stronger," Patch pointed out, "makes us better warriors, makes us better protectors. How is this not leadership?" Before she could answer, her communicator chimed with an emergency alert. The sound cut through the cafeteria noise like a blade, and conversations died as other devices began echoing the same urgent tone. "All personnel to emergency stations," the station's AI announced in its maddeningly calm voice. "This is not a drill. All personnel to emergency stations immediately." Brooke was on her feet before the announcement finished, her military training overriding 3 weeks of academic routine. Around the cafeteria, other faculty and students were rising as well, though with considerably less coordination. "What is emergency stations?" Gruff asked, but he was already moving, his massive frame shifting into the alert crouch she'd seen him adopt when he sensed potential threats. "Depends on the emergency," Brooke replied, checking her communicator for specific instructions. "Could be anything from system failures to external attacks to—" She paused, reading the update that had just appeared on her screen. "Oh. Oh." Rumble's voice carried a note of concern. "Training accident in the lower levels. Simulation chamber collapse. Multiple casualties trapped." She looked up at her 3 students who were watching her with the focused attention of predators awaiting orders. "Rescue teams are being assembled." The cubs looked at each other, then back at her. Some kind of wordless communication passed between them, the same silent understanding she'd observed that first day in the classroom. "We help," Patch said simply. "Absolutely not." Brooke's response was immediate and automatic. "You're students, not rescue personnel. This requires trained specialists with proper equipment and—" "Teacher thing, Brooke," Gruff interrupted gently. "What are proper qualifications for digging trapped pack members from collapsed Denny?" She opened her mouth to explain about emergency protocols and liability issues and the dozen different regulations that prohibited unauthorized personnel from participating in rescue operations. Then she closed it again, because the answer to Gruff's question was suddenly, blindingly obvious. Strength, courage, the willingness to risk your own safety for others, and claws that could tear through debris that would stop conventional rescue equipment cold. Her communicator chimed again with an updated status report. The situation was worse than initially reported. The simulation chamber hadn't just collapsed, it had collapsed in such a way that standard rescue equipment couldn't reach the trapped cadets. The available access points were too small for most species, and the debris was too unstable for conventional excavation. 18 cadets from 6 different species were trapped in a space that was slowly filling with toxic gas from damaged life support systems. Estimated survival time: 4 hours. Estimated time for specialized rescue equipment to arrive? 6 hours. "How much weight can the 3 of you lift working together?" she asked. "Together?" Rumble tilted his head thoughtfully. "Perhaps 8 tons? 10 if the grip surface allows proper claw purchase." "And you can fit through spaces how small?" "Smaller than you would expect," Patch said with what might have been pride. "Ursine warriors learn to move through tight spaces for hunting. Big prey often hides in small places." Brooke looked around the cafeteria, where faculty and students were still milling about in various states of confusion and concern. Then she looked at her 3 cubs, who were waiting for her decision with the patient readiness of soldiers who trusted their commander's judgment. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Somewhere in the last 3 weeks, without her noticing, they had become her soldiers. Not her students, not her responsibility, but her warriors. And warriors didn't stand by while people died. "Right," she said, switching her communicator to command frequency. "Emergency coordination. This is Captain Brooke. I'm assembling a specialized rescue team and proceeding to the lower levels." "Captain Brooke, please maintain your position. Only authorized rescue personnel are—" She switched off the communicator and looked at her cubs. "This is going to violate about 15 different regulations, end all our careers, and probably get us court-martialed." "And the trapped pack members?" Gruff asked. "Will probably live because of it?" The 3 cubs stood in unison, their movement so perfectly coordinated it looked choreographed. In that moment, Brooke finally understood what she'd been seeing in their behavior over the past weeks. It wasn't just pack loyalty or student dedication. It was something deeper, something that transcended species and culture and regulations. It was the recognition of a leader worth following, by warriors who had chosen to follow her. Well, she said, checking her equipment belt and wishing she'd brought more than a standard emergency kit. I guess we're about to find out what happens when the immovable object of military bureaucracy meets the unstoppable force of three very determined Ursine warriors. Teacher Thing Brooke, Rumble said, as they headed for the emergency lifts. What is bureaucracy? Something that's about to learn why human military doctrine includes a very important concept called acceptable losses, she replied grimly. As they entered the lift and began their descent to the lower levels, Brooke reflected on the irony of her situation. 3 weeks ago, she'd volunteered to teach 3 unmanageable alien students. Now she was leading those same students into a rescue operation that would either save 18 lives or add 4 more casualties to the day's tally. The cubs stood beside her in the lift, silent and ready, their earlier playfulness replaced by the focused intensity of warriors preparing for battle. She'd succeeded in teaching them to be more than just fighters. She just hoped she'd taught them well enough to survive what came next. The rescue took 3 hours, 42 minutes, and cost Brooke 2 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and what would probably be her career. The cubs fared better physically. Ursine physiology was apparently designed for crawling through unstable debris fields. But all 4 of them were now sitting in the Institute's medical bay, with security guards posted outside their doors. Through the transparent aluminum of her room's window, Brooke could see the cubs in the adjacent ward. Gruff was arguing with a medical technician about the structural integrity of the diagnostic bed, which had been groaning ominously under his weight. Patch was systematically cataloging the room's contents with the focused attention of someone planning either an escape or a renovation project. Rumble sat quietly in the corner, but his ears were constantly moving, tracking every sound in the corridor beyond. They'd saved all 18 cadets, every single one. The door to her room slid open, and Administrator Pelquan entered, flanked by 2 security officers and carrying a datapad that was undoubtedly loaded with disciplinary charges. His expression suggested he was looking forward to this conversation about as much as she was. "Captain Brooke," he said without preamble, "you have approximately 10 minutes to explain why I shouldn't have you and your students transported to the nearest detention facility, pending formal court-martial proceedings." Brooke shifted carefully in her medical bed, trying to find a position that didn't make her ribs feel like broken glass. "Because we saved 18 lives that your authorized rescue teams couldn't reach? You violated direct orders, endangered civilian students, and caused approximately 2 million credits worth of additional structural damage in the process." Pelquan's voice carried the clipped precision of someone who had spent the last 4 hours explaining the situation to very angry superiors. "The fact that your unauthorized actions happen to produce positive results does not excuse the fundamental breach of protocol." "Fundamental breach of protocol," Brooke repeated slowly. "Is that what we're calling it when people choose to save lives instead of following regulations?" "It's what we call it when instructors place students in life-threatening situations without proper authorization, training, or equipment." The administrator consulted his datapad. "According to the preliminary reports, you led 3 cadets with no formal rescue certification into an unstable disaster zone using improvised techniques and salvaged equipment. Any one of you could have been killed. But we weren't. That's not the point." "Isn't it?" Brooke managed to sit up straighter, ignoring the way the movement sent spikes of pain through her shoulder. "Because, from where I'm sitting, the point seems pretty clear. 18 cadets were trapped in a space that conventional rescue teams couldn't reach, with a survival window that was closing fast. My students had the physical capabilities to access that space and the strength to clear the obstacles. So we went in and brought everyone out alive. Pelquan's expression hardened. Your students are not trained rescue specialists. They're barely trained students at all, from what I understand. They're warriors, Brooke said simply. And warriors protect people. That's what they do. They're cadets in an academic institution, Captain, not soldiers in an active combat zone. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the corridor. Through her window, Brooke could see a crowd gathering outside the medical bay. Faculty members, administrative staff, and what looked like half the student body. The security guards were trying to maintain order, but the crowd was growing larger and more vocal by the minute. One of Pelquan's escorts touched his communicator and listened briefly. Sir, there's been a development. What kind of development? The families of the rescued cadets have been contacting the Institute. They're demanding to speak with Captain Brooke and her team. Pelquan's expression shifted from administrative irritation to something approaching panic. Demanding? What kind of demands? Well, sir. The guard glanced at his communicator again. Most of them seem to want to thank her. But there are also some requesting that she be formally commended for her actions, and several have indicated they'll be filing complaints if any disciplinary action is taken against the rescue team. Through the medical bay's windows, Brooke could see more people arriving. Some she recognized as faculty members she'd never spoken to. Others appeared to be civilians, probably the families the guard had mentioned. But what caught her attention was the group of students standing near the entrance, all wearing the insignia of different species and academic tracks. They were the 18 cadets her team had pulled out of the collapsed chamber. Administrator Pelquan, she said quietly, I think your 10 minutes might be up. The administrator turned to follow her. Gaze, and his expression went from panic to something approaching despair. The crowd outside wasn't just growing, it was organizing. Students were forming orderly lines, faculty members were checking data pads and making notes, and someone had apparently brought refreshments. This is highly irregular, Pelquan muttered. So is risking your life to save people, Brooke replied, but sometimes irregular is exactly what the situation calls for. The door opened again, and Professor Ketmar entered. The crystalline being's form was cycling through colors Brooke had never seen before, which her database unhelpfully informed her indicated either extreme agitation or profound philosophical confusion. Administrator Pelquan, Ketmar said, without his usual mathematical precision, I believe we may need to reconsider our approach to this situation. What do you mean? I mean that in the past 4 hours, I have received 17 formal requests for enrollment in Captain Brooke's tactical psychology courses, from species that have never previously shown interest in human military methodology. The professor's form shifted to a deep blue. Additionally, 3 other instructors have requested to observe her teaching methods, and the Centauri Diplomatic Corps has inquired about including her curriculum in their advanced training programs. Pelquan stared at the professor, then at Brooke, then at the crowd outside. This is about the rescue. This is about the results, Ketmar corrected. Captain Brooke accomplished something that our most advanced rescue protocols could not. She created a functional combat unit from 3 students that every other instructor had classified as unmanageable. And she did it using methods that appear to violate every established pedagogical principle. Methods that work, Brooke added. Methods that produce warriors instead of just soldiers, a new voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Gruff standing in the entrance, with Patch and Rumble flanking him. The Cubs had apparently convinced their guards that medical supervision was no longer necessary. and they moved with the quiet confidence of people who belonged exactly where they were. "You should not be here," Pelquan said weakly. "We go where Teacher Thing Brooke goes," Rumble said simply. "She taught us that warriors choose their battles and their leaders. We have chosen." "Chosen what, exactly?" Gruff looked directly at the administrator, his massive frame filling the doorway. "Chosen to follow the human who taught us that strength without wisdom is just destruction. That courage without loyalty is just recklessness. That being a warrior means protecting others, not just defeating enemies." Patch nodded agreement. "The other teacher things tried to make us smaller, tried to make us fit their boxes and follow their rules. Teacher Thing Brooke made us larger, showed us what we could become." "And what is that?" Ketmar asked, his form shifting to an HFY interested green. "Warriors who think," Rumble answered. "Fighters who protect. Students who choose their own learning." Administrator Pelquan looked around the room, his expression suggesting he was rapidly recalculating his position. Outside, the crowd had grown to include what appeared to be representatives from several major galactic powers, all of whom seemed very interested in the human instructor who had turned 3 unmanageable students into an effective rescue team. "Captain Brooke," he said finally, "it appears that your methods, however unorthodox, have produced some unexpected results." "Unexpected?" "Well, successful. Dramatically successful." He paused, consulting his datapad again. "I've just received word that the Institute's board of directors would like to discuss expanding your program. They're particularly interested in your approach to interspecies military cooperation." Brooke looked at her 3 cubs, who were watching her with the patient attention of students waiting for their next lesson. "And what would that expansion involve?" "A new department," Pelquan said, his tone suggesting he was still processing the implications himself. "Practical warrior development, with you as the department head and your methods as the core curriculum." "My methods?" "Teaching students to choose their loyalty instead of simply following orders. Creating bonds based on respect rather than authority. Developing warriors who think for themselves while remaining committed to their cause." He looked directly at her. "The board believes this approach might be exactly what the galaxy needs right now." Brooke settled back in her medical bed, ignoring the protests from her ribs. Outside her window, the crowd was still growing, but now it included representatives from military academies across the galaxy, all apparently interested in learning about the human instructor who had accomplished the impossible. "So," she said to her cubs, "looks like our little experiment in education just became something bigger." "How much bigger?" Gruff asked. Brooke smiled. "Big enough that instead of asking how to tame you, they're going to start asking how to find more students like you." "And the answer?" Rumble prompted. "The answer," she said, looking at the 3 warriors who had chosen to follow her not because they had to, but because they wanted to, "is that you don't find them. You help them find themselves." Outside her window, the crowd continued to grow, but Brooke's attention was focused on her 3 students. They weren't cubs anymore, she realized. Somewhere between that first shared lunch and this moment in the medical bay, they had become exactly what she'd always known they could be. Warriors who had chosen their path, their leader, and their cause. And that, she thought, made all the regulations they'd broken entirely worth it.